That's well.
Hello, my name is John Smithin, and I'm the Executive Co-Director of the Aurora Philosophy Institute, or API, here in Aurora, Ontario, Canada. And with me today is someone who is not in Aurora, Ontario, Canada, namely Henry Chausovsky, Vice President Central America of the API. Before we get going, before Henry and I start, I should say that this video will shortly be up on the API YouTube channel. So if you are seeing it there, please do subscribe, make comments, and hopefully like it. We need your support to grow the channel. So I think you're in Costa Rica right now, Henry. Welcome.
Thanks, John. Yes, this time, yes, I'm in Costa Rica.
Good. So Henry, what I would like to talk about today is things like critical thinking, critical realism, and so on. Basically anything with the word critical in the title. And so to give you some background for this, a couple of months ago, our API colleague Ronan Grunberg gave a very interesting talk about the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan, which is up on the YouTube channel now. Then later on, Ronan and I recorded a dialogue on one specific aspect of the original presentation, which was the extent to which McLuhan could be described as a realist philosopher. Now, this is a very interesting question because, of course, McLuhan was a Catholic convert and presumably, therefore, accepted the official church doctrine of Thomism. Moreover, he was a colleague at St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, of two very famous Catholic philosophers, namely Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson, who most definitely were metaphysical realists in the Thomist tradition. On the other hand, during our original discussion, another of our API colleagues also mentioned that McLuhan was appreciative of the work of another University of Toronto Catholic philosopher, Bernard Lonergan, who was a self-proclaimed critical realist, with the emphasis on the term critical there, critical realist. So regardless of which side McLuhan eventually came down on, this does raise the whole question of the difference between a metaphysical realist and a critical realist. And beyond that, the actual meaning of the term critical itself. Now, as I recall, you were also a part of that original discussion, and moreover, later I did see contributed to the comments thread on both of those YouTube discussions. So I would like to ask you now, what was your take on the whole thing?
Well, yes, there is some relevance to McLuhan. He was a media theorist, and for example, his famous phrase, the medium is the message. What I was saying is that it is somewhat ironic that also intellectuals often pontificate a great deal about media influence and the importance of critical thinking. They very rarely seem to apply critical thinking to the media narrative itself. What is the reason for this exception? Besides, as you know, the need for certainty, often the enemy of obedience. In recent years, particularly the narrative of the mainstream media or MSM seems just to be accepted without question by most people, and perhaps above all by the so-called intellectuals and professors. When we are present with the statement, media helps us to discover the world, media has a potential to enlighten us, the critical thinking is immediately triggered by the immateriality of this premise. Critical thinking means questioning things to ensure they reside on a strong empirical or factual foundation. Then we have to ask ourselves, what is media? What drives its statements? And also question the underlying reason. Something which is so vulnerable to abuse can be used to change our cognition, to the desired output and respective behavior. To put it simply, its message can only be trusted by employing critical thinking. I believe that the capacity for critical thinking is a natural trait, but that requires a great effort to develop it, practice, and eventually acquire knowledge. Ideally, the schools should help to develop or nurture this capacity. However, today, and for several generations past, they have not been doing so. There is an obvious reason for that, but I will not get there now. In my opinion, philosophy is a tool to perfect what is given to you by God. However, this tool must be employed constantly. It needs to be put in practice. It is not just a rightly shaped way of thinking, but a way of life. I cannot imagine a philosopher who doesn't question things, the rules, the norms, and the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, agree with that. I very much agree with that. So it makes me think what you'd said that different people use the term critical in different ways, and I think, if I can put it that way, of at least three different usages that we have in philosophy. Now, the first one of these, and this seems to me to be especially true in academia, is that the term critical may be used simply to signal that one's theory is progressive, leans to the left in some sense, critical of the existing society simply. For example, there was critical theory itself, which I believe was originally associated with the Frankfurt School. And another example that's very much discussed at the present time, as you know, is the so-called critical race theory, or CRT. So that's one way of using critical. Secondly, the traditional sense of the word critical, as you've just done. This, to me, just means reflection, thinking things out, concept formation, and so on. And as you say, and I do agree, this is simply the essence of philosophy. This is what means philosophy. Now, thinking about the aforementioned Jacques Maritain, even though Maritain was, in fact, a dyed-in-the-wool metaphysical realist, he actually used the term critical all the time in this precise sense. And that's the correct usage of the term critical. But given the sad state of philosophy by the time in the mid 20th century, when Maritain was writing, it ironically just caused immense confusion. The simple, plain notion of critical thinking. The third sense of the term, and this we get in particular in sort of what you might call academic philosophy. The third sense of that term, critical, is to mean someone who accepts the critique of knowledge, the so-called critique of knowledge. Now, this was the underlying project, really the entire project of so-called modern philosophy, starting with Cartesian doubt in the 17th century and through Locke, Hume, Kant, and onwards. I mean, Kant's book, if you remember, was literally called A Critique of Pure Reason. Now, the idea here is more than critical thinking. It's really a deep skepticism that knowledge, in the traditional sense, is achievable at all. Kant, for example, thought that space and time themselves are not real, but just categories of the human mind. I've got news for him at 71 years old. Space and time are real. Another thing, from in Kant's view, was that it's actually impossible to gain any knowledge of what he called the thing in itself. This is Kant's term for, things as they really are, simply because we can only observe it from a particular point of view, the human point of view. And so therefore, just by being limited humans, we can't eventually acquire knowledge. Now, my own personal opinion about this whole line of argument, and if you like, the whole trend of modern philosophy, is not that it's not at all convincing. In fact, it's very weak because it ignores precisely the difference between the intellect and the senses and the very act of concept formation itself. However, doing a thought experiment, supposing that one accepts this notion of the critique of knowledge, but also wants to establish that there is an external reality and that there are beings which exist independently of our consciousness, then one must become presumably a quote critical realist, however contradictory that notion may seem to be at first sight. So I think there are those three different ways of using the term critical, and that we get them confused in our conversation.
Yes, certainly there's a confusion between, but I agree with you that to be critical requires very much more than simply being progressive and accepting the standard narrative about such things. In fact, it is the opposite of that. It is the opposite of simply conforming on doing or going along to get along. Critical thinking, by way of contrast, does require effort, and those who possess this trait never refrain from utilizing it. I would like to think that both of us do that. However, those who lack this ability of mind need enormous effort to develop it, if it's possible at all. As to the critique of knowledge, I do tend to agree with the premise that there is no absolute knowledge. It's a larger subject, of course, but in my view, the idea of the critique of knowledge defines the Socratic approach to philosophy.
Yeah, you said no absolute knowledge. That's the phrase you use. Yeah. Okay. Uh, um, in a way, I think it does make sense to refer to Socrates, right? You said the Socratic approach to philosophy. Because, in a sense, Socrates was really Plato, of course. That is, it was Plato who actually wrote these Socratic dialogues. And I would argue, actually, that Plato himself was the godfather, if you will, or precursor of precisely the later modernist critique. What I have in mind there, of course, is the famous parable of the cave. But looking at it from another point of view, aren't those dialogues like just an attempt to arrive at knowledge itself? However, yes, it's difficult, however difficult that may be, but isn't it just an attempt to eventually arrive at knowledge by conversation? I mean, do they imply that it's impossible in principle to eventually to know?
Um, well, many times the conclusion in the dialogue seems to be that we simply do not know. Not always, certainly, but often we do not know. I think it is fair to say that the implication is that the absolute knowledge cannot be obtained. Well, I don't want to expand on the word absolute. However, since we don't have other means except relying on our limited cognitive and sensual capacity, we often have to assume the plausibility of our knowledge in order to protect us from insanity. We have no other option. Nietzsche, in his Beyond Good and Evil, continuously stresses doubt as a foundation of the philosophical approach to life. In his Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the disciples are requested not to become Zarathustra's blind followers, his ideas to the test, and cultivate their critical thinking. The omnibus dubitnatum proclaims Nietzsche, meaning everything must be doubted, which also agrees with Soren Kierkegaard's views. To come to the rational and plausible state, we question things and ideas, analyze and collect the facts, and use logic and what we call common sense by applying reductio ad absurdum to the point of absurdity. The method used to prove the falsity of a premise and demonstrate that its logical consequence is absurd, contradictory. We can call it if the devil's advocate approach, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, in any event, it seems that we have identified, if you can put it this way, the precise difference between metaphysical realism, in quotes per se, which is what my own former student, Dancy Mendoza, called realism per totum viam, following you in using these Latin terms, realism per totum viam. Dancy used that to mean realism all the way. So the difference between that metaphysical realism or realism per totum viam and critical realism being the realism that accepts this limitation on knowledge kind of idea. Now, in their recent book, which was called The Realist Turn, Rasmussen and Den All put the point in this way. They said as follows. They said metaphysical realism involves both an ontological and epistemological thesis, namely that there are beings that exist and that they are what they are apart from our cognition of them. And this is the second point. And also that we can know both the existence and the nature of things. That's the epistemological side of it. And there's also a quote from Gilson's Le Réalisme Méthodique, which I do like, which is this: the attempt to construct a critical realism is self-contradictory, like the idea of a squared circle.
Well, as I understand correctly, metaphysical realists argue that of our beliefs about our world could be objectively true, since true beliefs tell us how things are, and beliefs are objective when true or false, independently of what anyone might think. I do agree with this. Um, I do share the concept of metaphysical realism by admitting that there are things and beings that exist apart of our cognition, but disagree that we can know both the existence and nature of these things. Since our methods of cognition are limited, we cannot claim this type of knowledge without reasonable doubt. The main weakness of metaphysical realism is that if objects exist independent of our mind, then how can we obtain knowledge of them? This is really an epistemological problem. Yes, I tend to support the critical reason approach. There is a reality surely of some kind out there, but we are too ambitious if we think we can ever access all of
it. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, this thing does come up in these discussions. I think that realists do accept, it seems to me, like, these quote metaphysical realists do accept that it is difficult to obtain knowledge, that it takes a great deal of effort, and so on and so forth. But again, the real question is whether or not it is possible in principle, to acquire it. Right? We may not succeed, we may have some doubt, as you say, but the effort is not futile. The effort is not futile to try to understand knowledge. The modernists, on the other hand, I'm contrasting them to the sort of classics and the medievals ending with Aquinas. The modernists always seem to be raising doubts about the whole enterprise itself, thus undermining in some way the efficacy of the human mind. And if human beings cannot make up their own mind, they're very susceptible to appealing to authority of some kind, be it a religious authority or a political authority that just sort of, tells you what to do. Another quote, from Gilson, for example, is along the lines of an idealist thinks, but a realist knows. Now, it may have been the other way around. It may have been a realist knows, but an idealist thinks. That is, an idealist sort of thinks. I think that this might be true. I think that, whereas a realist kind of knows that such and such is true and can act, on that knowledge. The meaning is the same, but I can't actually remember now which came first. My mind is limited, apparently.
Knowledge, John, in terms of knowledge, I believe we are limited. We have no choice. Yes, we do claim that we do know. We don't know. However, our confidence in something we do know can be easily destroyed by questioning and utilizing our not just common sense, but as we say and as we discussed here, critical thinking.
Yeah, yeah.
I can be totally confident claiming that I know and my knowledge is absolute. There's always certain degree of relativity in my knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. No, no. I mean, here we do have like the distinction between, you know, the way in which Rasmussen and Deneau define, quote, metaphysical realism and critical realism. Uh, you know, Gilson, of course, would argue like is in fact the whole notion of a critical realism, in and of itself, a viable entity. Anyway, Henry, that. Thank you for this. I mean, I guess we've done what we've done the metaphysics and the epistemology. Next, we'll move on to the to the ethics and the politics. Or maybe we'll just stay with this. Anyway, it was really interesting. You see what I did there? It was really interesting talking to you, as always. We'll do this again.
Thank you, John. I think we have to continue with wonderful subject.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Henry. Bye.
Okay. Bye.